Okay, so this is chapter 23, the respiratory system. So we're starting with the respiratory system in your outline. Obviously, the respiratory system is to exchange gases, and how we do that in animals is different and also plants, it's very different, but all living organisms need to exchange gases from inside their cells or inside their tissues to the outside. So gas exchange always requires a respiratory surface, letter A. That surface can be different in different animals, right? So in something like an earthworm or a leech, the respiratory surface is actually their entire skin, their body surface. So you can see that the edge of their skin is thin enough where their circulatory fluid, right, in this case it's a closed system, will come very close to the surface. And these two membranes are so thin that carbon dioxide can diffuse out and oxygen diffuses in, again, based on diffusion gradients, right? Because there's more oxygen on the outside in the atmosphere than inside, so it's going to move in. So that's one respiratory surface, and that's why I mentioned like earthworms will actually come out after it's been raining because inside that dirt, all those air pockets have been filled with water, and so they're going to suffocate, so they need to come up out of that water. If you are a sea creature and you have gills, this is the same concept. These are specialized structures that allow a surface for gas exchange, right? So there's some circulatory system is going to come very close to this respiratory membrane and exchange gases, okay? If you are a little stink bug, then we have an internal respiratory surface. So we don't have things on the outside. It's not going to be the surface of their body, but you're going to have holes, right? And they're tiny little trachea. They're called trachea, tiny little holes along the body of an insect. And the gas will move in, and then this yellow line is going to act as that respiratory surface. So it's going to, and remember, insects have open circulatory systems. So there's no capillaries, but the fluid within their tissues will exchange gases with this area. So you have all this yellow line here built in. So this is kind of like a very simple lung. And then when you get to mammals or other organisms like us, we have lungs, right? So we bring in the air through our mouth and our trachea coming into the lungs, and then we have a very special respiratory surface within our lungs called alveoli. And this is little air sacs of our lungs, and that's going to be very close to the capillary network, right? Our blood vessels. And these guys are so thin that you're going to have diffusion taking place across the membranes here. Okay, so those are just different ways that organisms have gas exchange built in. So if you look at your notes, we have gas exchange, letter A. They can be moist skin, letter B. In the water, a lot of times it's the surfaces of the skin, or on gills, and on land we have lungs or tracheal systems. Okay, so our concept check here is, what's the respiratory system surface for a worm such as a leech or earthworm? And the answer is D, skin. Okay, so when we look at the human respiratory system, letter B, right, we kind of understand already that we have a lung, we have lungs to help us exchange gases or breathe in and out. We have a network of blood vessels that carry the gases into our body, and then we have diffusion taking place across our capillaries so that gases can go into a cell and away from the cell. And oxygen is used at the mitochondria to make ATP. Carbon dioxide is the waste product that mitochondria make, right? Remember the whole cellular respiration equation, the waste product is carbon dioxide. That will diffuse into the bloodstream. The blood will carry it back to the lungs. We can exhale that carbon dioxide. So let's look at the anatomy of our respiratory system. Okay, so I already talked about hemoglobin, so I'm going to skip that condition. We talked about anemia, which is what number 3 is talking about. Letter C, anatomy of the respiratory tract. Number 1, the pharynx. So the pharynx is going to be this, what we call the throat. Okay, so it's the back of not only our mouth, but it's the very, very back of our nose. So the back of our nose is connected to the back of our mouth, is connected to a little bit lower than our tongue, right here. So this entire passageway back here is called the pharynx. When you get to anatomy, we separate it out. We say nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. But for now, it's just pharynx. Then you're going to have a larynx. Larynx is known as your voice box. You see these little two little bulges there. That's your vocal cords. Okay, so your respiratory system is responsible for making your voice, and the cartilaginous structure that holds your vocal cords right here is called the larynx. The trachea is your windpipe. So the trachea is going to be underneath the larynx. So the larynx is connected to the trachea. The trachea is going to allow the air to go down, and then the trachea will split because now we're going to have that pathway move into our lungs. The largest split, right, the largest tubes or airways of our lungs are called bronchi. Bronchi is plural. The word bronchus is singular. And so the bronchi are going to go into the lungs, and as they get smaller, and every time they branch, they get smaller, the smaller ones are called bronchioles. Okay, so a bronchi or bronchus will continue to divide into bronchioles. The bronchioles will begin to get microscopic, and then at the very end of the lungs, we have structures called alveoli. So the alveoli are going to be these air sacs, right? They're round little air sacs, and that's where we have the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, because that's our respiratory membrane. That's what's going to be the gas exchange area. Okay, so alveoli are the air sacs of the lungs where you have gas exchange. Okay, so let me just mention too, the respiratory tract. Your nasal cavity is also part of the respiratory system. I left that out of your outline. Please add it in. But when you breathe, the respiratory system has been sort of evolved to breathe in through your nose, because when you breathe in through your nose, your nasal cavity is designed, or I guess evolved, to humidify and to clean the air and to also warm the air. You see these ridges that you have drawn into this woman's face. Those ridges are to help circulate the air and so it can warm and humidify and clean it. So how does your nose clean the air? Well, yes, you have nose hairs that will filter out really big objects. But then once you get into the nasal cavity, you have mucus, and you have that mucus is going to trap the heavier dust particles and heavier particulates so that it doesn't go down into your lungs. In fact, you have mucus protecting your lungs all the way down in your trachea. In the large bronchi, you still have mucus. But by the time you get to the bronchioles, you don't have mucus anymore because they're too small to have mucus. If they had mucus, you'd not be able to breathe. But that's one of the jobs of the respiratory system. So when you are breathing, the healthier way to breathe is to breathe in through your nose and not to be a mouth breather. You can breathe out through your mouth, that's fine, but like in through the nose is actually the healthier way to breathe. So let's think about what's coming up next. So I'll show you the cadaver lungs at the end here. But let's think about how we breathe. So when you breathe, you are basically using the muscles of your chest and also the muscle of your diaphragm to either increase the size of your thoracic cage or decrease the size of the thoracic cage. So look what's happening here. So if you just take a look overall, the lungs are much bigger in this picture. The thoracic cage is much bigger in this picture. We have arrows moving up. So this is what the rib cage, the muscles that hold on to the rib cage, they're going to move the rib cage up and away. Your sternum is also moved up and away, and the diaphragm is going to get pulled down. So it just makes everything bigger here. So there's a relationship between the size of your thoracic cage and the pressure, okay? So the bigger the size of the thoracic cage, and by bigger, I mean the volume is large. If you have a large volume, then the air pressure is low, okay? There's an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. So as the volume goes up, the pressure drops, okay? When the pressure drops, we call that negative pressure, and the air from the outside is naturally going to get drawn into your negative pressure space, okay? So that is how we inhale. We don't forcefully pull the air in like we think we're doing. Rather, we're creating a negative pressure within our thoracic cage that creates this natural flow of air in. When you, and that's going to be obviously inhaling, right? You inhale the air. When you exhale, different muscles will move the ribs down, move the sternum down. The diaphragm relaxes, and when the diaphragm relaxes, it becomes very dome-shaped. But everything that happens here makes the volume smaller. So when the volume gets smaller, the pressure is higher, okay? So air pressure is high here compared to the outside, it's low. So the air is going to want to move to low pressure or that negative pressure, and it's going to move out, okay? So when we breathe, it's really this relationship between the size of our thoracic cavity, the volume, and the pressure inside of our thoracic cage versus the pressure in the atmosphere, okay? So this is a nice GIF of what's happening here, right? So as the diaphragm contracts, when it goes down, the thoracic cage gets bigger, right? And when it gets bigger, the pressure decreases and the air particles come in. It's kind of hard to talk about because it's fast. And then when you relax the diaphragm, it goes up. The thoracic cage gets smaller. When it gets smaller, the pressure builds up, and there's more negative pressure. The air pressure outside is less, so the air particles naturally flow out. So that is breathing. Okay, go ahead and take a look at the concept check. When the diaphragm contracts, what happens when it contracts? A or B? You should answer letter B here. It gets larger, and we are inhaling letter C. Okay. Let's talk about the next damage to the respiratory system. So the respiratory system, there's a lot of features that protect the respiratory system from getting damaged. One of the structures is called the mucociliary escalator. And all along the trachea, which is pictured here, and the bronchi, which are the larger tubes of the lungs or airways of the lungs I mentioned, have mucus. That mucus traps the particulates that you're inhaling. So it can be dust particles, it can be the pollution in the air. It can also be little mold spores or bacteria or whatever it is, viruses, right? The respiratory droplets that we inhale. Whatever it is, the mucus will trap it. And then you have cilia, right? So here are the cells that line your respiratory tract, and then those purple lines, those are the cilia. The cilia is going to move up. So it's going to sweep that mucus up our trachea to basically the back of our throats, where when we swallow, that little bit of mucus coming from our lungs gets swallowed as well. So it goes into our stomach instead of going into our lungs. And it protects those air sacs of the lungs. Remember, those air sacs, those alveoli, are at the very, very end of our bronchial tree. And that's where gas exchange happens. So this alveoli needs to be very clean, very sterile. There should be nothing coming in here, no particulates. It happens over your life, it does, but you're trying to keep that clean. And your body's trying to move all those particulates up with this escalator, right? So constantly throughout your life, those cilia are beating and they're moving that mucus with trapped particulates up away from the alveoli. When you damage your lungs, and tobacco smoke is one of these things that can damage the mucociliary escalator, it slows everything down. So the cilia are damaged, and so instead of moving everything up quickly, it can slow down. And one of the mechanisms that helps you move the mucus up very quickly, and if your lungs get full of mucus, you cough, right? So coughing helps to physically push that mucus up out of your lungs into your throat. And of course, you do whatever you do with that. But that is one of the, our way of getting that mucus off. So if you're a smoker, or if you know smokers, sometimes they will cough a lot, and it's called smoker's cough. because they're physically damaging their cilia and the mucociliary escalator is not working, so they have to compensate by coughing and moving that mucus up with coughing. There are other things that can cause mucus to stay in your lungs, like cystic fibrosis, but tobacco does that. And so if you have damage, if you have this particulates leading, they're not leaving your lung, they stay in your lung, or they get into the areas of the alveoli, they can cause damage. And over time, that damage can lead to breathing problems. There's other terrible things in tobacco smoke also. There's carcinogens, which can cause cancer. So best not to smoke, as we all know. So anyhow, that's what I wanted to talk about, the mucociliary escalator. Let's look at a normal lung and a smoker's lung. So I cannot tell you how long this person has been smoking, but I can say that the black areas are tar deposits. And you can see there's normal black areas of the lung as well. So after a long life of living in an urban city like Los Angeles, you will get over time just deposits of this soot, and just, just living in air that's not completely clean, you're going to get some deposits over a lifetime. But this is very different, right? So this is a person who has been smoking, and the white areas are areas of lung cancer. So very, very terrible looking lung, where a healthy lung is nice and pink. And this would be very spongy. It would feel like a very soft sponge, whereas this one, it would not. It would feel hard, especially the cancer areas would be very, very hard. And these areas would be not flexible either. And I'll put this link in the modules so you can see the normal and smoker's lung. And I think that's it. So that is it for this lecture.